Captain Sarah Mitchell walked through the bustling corridors of the Pentagon, her polished boots clicking against the marble floors. At 28, she had already earned more commendations than most officers twice her age, but today she felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. Her petite frame and youthful appearance often led people to make assumptions about her role in the military. She carried a thick folder containing classified mission reports and strategic analyses that would shape the next phase of operations in the Middle East. These weren't just any documents, they contained intelligence she had personally gathered during her last deployment, where she had successfully infiltrated a terrorist cell and prevented a major attack on American soil. The mission had taken 8 months of dangerous undercover work, speaking fluent Arabic and Farsi, while maintaining her cover as a humanitarian aid worker. As Sarah approached the conference room where the high-level briefing would take place, she noticed the curious glances from other military personnel. Some nodded respectfully when they saw her uniform and rank insignia, but others seemed puzzled by her presence in this section of the building. The Pentagon was still very much an old boys' club, despite the progress women had made in the military. Commander Jake Harrison was already waiting outside the conference room, reviewing his notes on a tablet. Jake was a decorated Navy SEAL with 15 years of combat experience, and Sarah had worked closely with him on several joint operations. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that made people automatically assume he was in charge of any situation. "Ready for this briefing?" Jake asked as Sarah approached. His tone was friendly but carried the subtle assumption that she was there in a support capacity, perhaps to take notes or handle administrative duties. It wasn't malicious. Jake had always treated her with respect, but even he sometimes forgot the full extent of her qualifications and achievements. Sarah smiled and nodded, choosing not to correct his assumption just yet. She had learned over the years that sometimes it was more effective to let people reveal their biases before demonstrating her true capabilities. The element of surprise often worked in her favor, both in combat situations and in boardroom politics. They entered the conference room together, and Sarah immediately noticed the dynamics at play. The room was filled with high-ranking military officials, intelligence officers, and Pentagon brass. Most were men in their 40s and 50s, with silver hair and chests full of ribbons and medals. When Jake entered, several people stood to greet him warmly, shaking hands and exchanging the kind of military camaraderie that came from shared experiences in dangerous places. Sarah, walking slightly behind Jake, received polite nods and brief acknowledgments. She could see the mental calculations happening in people's minds as they tried to figure out her role. Some assumed she was Jake's aide or perhaps a junior intelligence analyst brought along to assist with technical details. Others thought she might be a public affairs officer or a liaison from another department. General Morrison, a stern-faced man with 3 stars on his shoulders, gestured for everyone to take their seats. "Gentlemen and lady," he added with a quick glance at Sarah, "we have a lot to cover today. The situation in the region has become increasingly complex, and we need to discuss our next steps carefully." Sarah took a seat toward the back of the room, noting how Jake was invited to sit closer to the head of the table. She opened her folder and began reviewing her notes, occasionally glancing up to observe the other attendees. Years of intelligence work had trained her to read body language and social dynamics, skills that served her well in environments like this. The briefing began with a presentation from Colonel Stevens, who outlined the current security situation in several Middle Eastern countries. Sarah listened carefully, noting several inaccuracies in his assessment that she would need to address when it was her turn to speak. Her recent time in the field had given her insights that weren't reflected in the sanitized reports that typically made their way up the chain of command. As the presentation continued, Sarah noticed Admiral Thompson entering the room quietly. He was a man in his early 60s with distinguished gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His 4 stars marked him as one of the most senior officers in the Navy, and his presence immediately elevated the importance of the meeting. What most people in the room didn't know was that Admiral Thompson had been Sarah's mentor since her early days in the Naval Academy. He had recognized her potential when she was just a midshipman and had quietly guided her career, ensuring she received the challenging assignments that would develop her skills and advance her career. He was one of the few people who knew the full extent of her classified work and the risks she had taken for her country. Admiral Thompson took a seat near the front of the room, his eyes briefly meeting Sarah's across the crowded space. She saw the slight smile that crossed his face. He was clearly amused by the situation and the assumptions people were making about her role in the meeting. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with various officers presenting their perspectives on regional threats and recommended strategies. Sarah made notes and waited for the right moment to contribute to the conversation. She could see that some of the proposed approaches were based on outdated intelligence and would likely be ineffective, or even counterproductive. Finally, General Morrison looked around the room and said, "Before we move to the next phase of the discussion, I believe we have some updated intelligence from recent field operations. Commander Harrison, would you like to brief us on your team's findings?" Jake stood up, but before he could begin speaking, he looked back at Sarah and said, "Actually, sir, I think Captain Mitchell would be better positioned to provide this briefing. She has more recent and detailed information about the situation on the ground." The room fell silent for a moment as all eyes turned to Sarah. She could sense the surprise and confusion from some of the attendees who hadn't expected her to be presenting intelligence rather than simply observing. She stood up calmly, gathered her materials, and walked to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had briefed much more dangerous audiences in much more hostile environments. As Sarah began setting up her presentation materials, she could feel the shift in the room's energy. The assumption that she was there in a support role was beginning to crack, and people were starting to reassess their initial impressions. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Sarah moved to the front of the conference room with practiced ease, her movements deliberate and confident. She had given countless briefings in far more challenging circumstances, in bombed-out buildings in Afghanistan, in the back of military transport planes, and even once while treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital. The polished Pentagon conference room felt almost luxurious by comparison. She connected her laptop to the projection system and pulled up a detailed map of the Middle Eastern region, marked with current intelligence data that was less than 72 hours old. The information she was about to share had come at great personal risk, gathered during covert operations that most of the people in the room didn't even know had taken place. "Gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice clear and authoritative, "the intelligence briefings you've received this morning, while accurate as far as they go, don't tell the complete story. Over the past 8 months, I've been conducting deep cover operations in the region, and what I've discovered changes our understanding of the threat landscape significantly." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a network of connections between various terrorist organizations that previous intelligence had missed. The room's attention was now completely focused on her presentation, and she could see the surprise on many faces as they began to realize the scope of what she was about to reveal. Colonel Stevens, who had given the earlier briefing, leaned forward in his chair. "Captain, are you saying that our current intelligence assessments are incomplete?" His tone carried a hint of skepticism, as if he found it hard to believe that this young woman could have information that had eluded the entire intelligence community. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Not incomplete, Colonel, but limited by the sources available to traditional intelligence gathering methods. When you're sitting in an office in Langley or the Pentagon, you're dependent on signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and reports from assets in the field. But when you're actually embedded with the people you're trying to understand, you gain insights that can't be obtained any other way." She clicked to the next slide, which showed photographs of several key terrorist leaders that she had taken personally during her undercover work. The images were clear and recent, showing these individuals in locations that intelligence services had been trying to identify for months. 3 months ago, I was sitting in a cafe in Damascus, drinking tea with Ahmad Hassan al-Rashid. She pointed to one of the photographs. Most of our intelligence suggested he was hiding somewhere in the mountains along the Pakistani border. In reality, he's been operating openly in urban areas, using a network of legitimate businesses as cover for his operations. The room erupted in quiet murmurs as the implications of this information sank in. General Morrison raised his hand for silence. Captain Mitchell, how were you able to get close to al-Rashid? Our best estimates suggested that his security was impenetrable. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. He thought I was Dr. Sarah Halil, a Palestinian-American medical researcher working with Doctors Without Borders. I spent 4 months building that identity, learning to speak Arabic with a Palestinian accent, studying Islamic theology, and even completing a crash course in emergency medicine. By the time I approached his organization, offering to provide medical services to their fighters, I was completely convincing in my role. Jake Harrison, who had been listening intently, shook his head in amazement. He had known Sarah was skilled, but he was just beginning to understand the true extent of her capabilities. Sarah, when you say you were embedded with them for 4 months, you mean you were living among known terrorists, with no backup, no extraction plan? The extraction plan was simple, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Don't get caught. And if I did get caught, make sure the information I had gathered would still make it back to our people. She touched her watch unconsciously. It contained a hidden data storage device that she had never had to use, but which had been her insurance policy throughout the operation. Admiral Thompson, who had been sitting quietly throughout the presentation, finally spoke up. Captain, perhaps you could explain to our colleagues here how you came to develop these particular skills. Your background might be illuminating. Sarah nodded, understanding that the Admiral was giving her permission to reveal aspects of her training and experience that were typically classified. Before my current assignment, I spent 2 years with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Division. I was trained in deep cover operations, including advanced language instruction, cultural immersion, and what the agency calls adaptive identity construction. She paused, looking around the room at the faces that were now regarding her with a mixture of respect and astonishment. I've operated undercover in 6 different countries, speaking 5 languages fluently enough to pass as a native speaker. In Afghanistan, I posed as a Pashtun village teacher for 8 months. In Somalia, I worked as an aid coordinator for the UN while tracking weapons shipments. Each operation required me to become someone else completely, to the point where I sometimes forgot my real identity for weeks at a time. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, an intelligence officer from the Air Force, raised his hand. Captain, with respect, this level of operational independence is unusual for someone of your rank. Who authorized these operations? Before Sarah could answer, Admiral Thompson stood up. The entire room immediately fell silent. When a 4-star admiral stands during a meeting, everyone pays attention. His voice carried the weight of decades of military leadership when he spoke. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, Captain Mitchell's operations were authorized at the highest levels of government. Her work has prevented at least 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil, saved countless civilian lives, and provided intelligence that has shaped our entire Middle Eastern strategy for the past 2 years. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. What you're seeing today is just a small sample of her capabilities. The Admiral's endorsement transformed the atmosphere in the room completely. Officers who had been skeptical were now looking at Sarah with new respect, and those who had been merely polite were now paying close attention to every word she said. Sarah continued her briefing, detailing the terrorist network's financial operations, their recruitment methods, and their plans for future attacks. The information was so current and detailed that it would require immediate action from multiple agencies. She had identified safe houses, weapons caches, and communication networks that represented years of intelligence gathering compressed into a single, extraordinarily dangerous operation. As she spoke, Sarah was aware that she was shattering assumptions about who could be an effective intelligence operative and what kinds of risks people were willing to take for their country. Her success had come not despite her appearance and gender, but in many ways because of them. In the male-dominated world of Middle Eastern terrorism, A young woman offering medical assistance was often seen as harmless, a perception that had allowed her to move freely in circles that would have been impossible for a traditional male operative to penetrate. The revelation of Sarah's true role sent ripples of whispered conversations through the conference room. Officers who had been dismissive or condescending just minutes earlier were now looking at her with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. The young woman they had assumed was Jake's assistant had just demonstrated knowledge of terrorist operations that surpassed anything in their classified briefings. Sarah continued her presentation, clicking through slides that showed the interconnected web of terrorist financing she had uncovered. While embedded with al-Rashid's organization, I discovered that their funding doesn't come primarily from the sources we've been monitoring. Yes, they receive some money from traditional donors in the Gulf states, but their main revenue stream is something we never suspected. She displayed a series of photographs showing what appeared to be ordinary commercial shipping containers at various ports around the Mediterranean. To the untrained eye, they looked like standard cargo shipments, but Sarah had annotated each image with detailed intelligence about their true contents. "They're running a sophisticated counterfeiting operation," she explained. "Not just currency, though they do that too, but high-end consumer goods. European luxury handbags, Swiss watches, German automotive parts. They've created an entire supply chain that looks completely legitimate on paper. The profits are enormous, and the operation is virtually undetectable through normal customs enforcement." General Morrison leaned forward, his expression grave. "Captain, how extensive is this operation? Are we talking about a few $1,000,000 or something more significant?" Sarah's next slide showed financial flowcharts that she had painstakingly reconstructed from fragments of information gathered over months of careful observation. Conservative estimates put their annual revenue from counterfeiting at over $200 million. That's more than enough to fund major terrorist operations indefinitely. But here's the real problem. This money isn't just funding attacks. In the Middle East, they're using it to establish sleeper cells in European and American cities. The room fell completely silent as the implications of this intelligence became clear. This wasn't just about preventing attacks in distant countries. It was about protecting homeland security in ways that no one had realized were necessary. Commander Jake Harrison, who had been listening with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "Sarah, when you say sleeper cells in American cities, do you have specific locations? Names? How immediate is this threat?" Sarah looked at Jake with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal concern. She had worked with him on several operations, and she knew he understood the weight of what she was about to reveal. "I have addresses in Chicago, Detroit, and Miami. I have names, photographs, and detailed information about their operational plans. The cell in Miami is planning an attack on the port during the holiday shipping season. They want to disrupt commerce and create maximum psychological impact during the busiest time of year." The gravity of this information was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Miami's port was one of the busiest in the country, handling billions of dollars in cargo every month. An attack during the holiday season wouldn't just cause casualties, it would devastate the American economy and shake public confidence in ways that would last for years. Admiral Thompson stood again, his face serious. "Captain Mitchell, I assume you have a recommended course of action based on your intelligence?" Sarah nodded and moved to her final slides, which outlined a comprehensive response strategy that she had developed during her months in the field. "We need coordinated action on multiple fronts. First, we need to neutralize the sleeper cells before they can execute their attacks. But if we move too quickly or too obviously, we'll alert the main organization and they'll simply establish new cells elsewhere." She clicked to a detailed timeline showing a carefully orchestrated series of operations. "I recommend a 3-phase approach. Phase 1 involves using the counterfeiting operation against them. If we can disrupt their revenue stream without making it obvious that we know about their terrorist activities, we can force them to make mistakes. Desperate people make poor operational security decisions." Colonel Stevens, who had been studying the financial information intently, looked up from his notes. How do you propose we disrupt a counterfeiting operation without triggering a larger response? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since she had begun speaking, there was a hint of the kind of tactical creativity that had made her so successful in the field. We make them think they have a business problem, not a security problem. European customs authorities can suddenly become much more efficient at detecting counterfeit luxury goods. Port inspections can become more thorough. Insurance companies can start asking uncomfortable questions about shipping manifests. She displayed a map showing the locations of key counterfeiting facilities that she had identified. Meanwhile, we use their own communication networks to feed them false information about law enforcement activities. I spent enough time with them to understand how they think and how they make decisions. If we apply pressure in the right places, we can manipulate them into revealing the locations of cells we haven't identified yet. Jake shook his head in admiration. You're talking about running a complex psychological operation against people who know you personally. If they figure out what you're doing, you'll be dead within hours. That's phase 2, Sarah replied calmly. I go back in. Dr. Sarah Halil contacts Al-Rashid's organization with urgent information about a supposed security breach in their European operations. I tell them I've learned that customs officials have been asking questions about some of their shipments. They'll want to meet with me to find out what I know and to assess whether their cover has been blown. The room erupted in concerned voices as the implications of her plan became clear. General Morrison raised his hand for silence, but his expression showed deep concern. Captain, you're proposing to walk back into a terrorist organization after gathering intelligence against them for months. The risk is enormous. Admiral Thompson had been listening to the discussion with careful attention, and now he spoke with the authority that came from decades of making life-and-death decisions. General, Captain Mitchell has successfully extracted herself from similar situations before. But I agree that the risk assessment needs to be thorough. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the officers who had gathered to hear what they thought would be a routine briefing. She could see that they were beginning to understand not just the scope of the threat they were facing, but the extraordinary lengths that some people were willing to go to protect their country. The risk to me personally is significant, she acknowledged. But the risk to American civilians if we don't act is far greater. The Miami operation is planned for the week before Christmas. That gives us less than 2 months to prevent an attack that could kill hundreds of people and cripple our economy during the most important commercial period of the year. She closed her laptop and gathered her materials, signaling that her formal presentation was complete. But the discussion that followed would determine whether her months of dangerous work would result in successful operations or merely detailed intelligence reports filed away in classified archives. The conference room buzzed with intense discussion as the weight of Sarah's intelligence settled over the assembled officers. What had begun as a routine briefing had transformed into an emergency planning session for preventing multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. General Morrison was already on his secure phone, calling in additional personnel and resources that would be needed for the complex operation. Sarah had outlined. Admiral Thompson approached Sarah as she finished packing her materials. His expression mixed pride with deep concern. He had mentored her for years, but even he hadn't fully grasped the extent of the risks she had been taking. Captain, he said quietly, I need to ask you something that should have been asked months ago. During your 8 months undercover, did you ever come close to being discovered? Were there moments when you thought the operation might be compromised? Sarah paused, considering how much to reveal about the psychological toll of her extended undercover work. Living a false identity for months at a time required a level of mental discipline that few people could sustain, and there had indeed been moments when her cover had been dangerously close to being blown. There were 3 incidents. Sir, she replied, keeping her voice low enough that their conversation remained private. The first was in Damascus, when al-Rashid asked me to treat one of his fighters who had been shot by Syrian government forces. The bullet had nicked an artery and he was bleeding internally. I had to perform emergency surgery with improvised tools while maintaining my cover as Dr. Halil. She could see the Admiral calculating the implications of what she was describing. Performing surgery while undercover meant that any mistake, medical or operational, could have exposed her identity and resulted in immediate execution. The second incident was worse, she continued. Al-Rashid became suspicious that one of his people was feeding information to Western intelligence agencies. He decided to test everyone in his inner circle, including me. He gave each of us different pieces of false information and waited to see which piece would show up in intelligence reports. Admiral Thompson's expression darkened as he realized the trap Sarah had found herself in. If she reported the false information, she would be identified as the leak. But if she stopped reporting altogether, her handlers would assume she had been compromised. I had to make the information disappear in a way that looked like natural intelligence failure, Sarah explained. I deliberately gave my contact corrupted data that would be dismissed as unreliable. It meant losing several weeks of valuable intelligence, but it maintained my cover. The third incident was the one she was most reluctant to discuss, because it had required her to make a moral choice that still haunted her. Al-Rashid asked me to help plan an attack on a refugee camp that he believed was harboring Syrian government informants. I had to provide medical advice about how to maximize casualties while appearing to support the operation. Admiral Thompson understood immediately why this had been so difficult for her. Sarah had joined the military to protect innocent people, and being forced to contribute to planning an attack on refugees even, as part of maintaining her cover, would have tested every principle she believed in. I gave him medical information that was technically accurate but tactically flawed, she said quietly. The attack failed because I had subtly misdirected their planning. But 17 people died anyway. I was there when it happened. I had to act like I supported what they were doing while watching innocent people get killed. The cost of intelligence gathering was something that most people in the Pentagon never had to confront directly. They dealt with abstract strategic concepts and statistical analyses, but Sarah had been forced to make impossible choices while surrounded by people who would have killed her instantly. If they had known her true identity, Jake Harrison had been listening to their conversation, and now he approached with an expression of deep respect mixed with concern. Sarah, I need to ask you something as your colleague and friend. Are you psychologically prepared to go back in? What you've described sounds like it would break most people. And you're proposing to voluntarily return to that environment. Sarah appreciated his concern, but she had already thought through the psychological implications of her plan extensively. Jake, the truth is that Dr. Halil has become as real to me as Captain Mitchell. When I'm undercover, I'm not pretending to be someone else, I become someone else. It's the only way to survive in that environment for extended periods. She could see that this revelation concerned both men, because it suggested a level of psychological adaptation that bordered on dissociation. But it was precisely this ability that had made her so effective as an undercover operative. The advantage of going back in is that they trust Dr. Halil completely, she continued. Al-Rashid considers me one of his most valuable assets. He's planning to expand the medical support for his operations, and he wants me to help train other doctors who can provide care for his fighters. General Morrison approached their group, having finished his urgent phone calls. Captain Mitchell, I've been in contact with the National Security Council. Your intelligence has been flagged for immediate presidential briefing, and we've been given authorization to proceed with your recommended operations. The speed of the response indicated just how seriously the government was taking the threat she had uncovered. Terrorist attacks on American ports during the holiday shipping season would have economic implications that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. However, the general continued, there are concerns at the highest levels about sending you back into such a dangerous situation. The President's national security team is asking whether we can achieve the same objectives using different methods. Sarah had expected this response. The government was always reluctant to put operatives at unnecessary risk, especially when those operatives possessed unique skills and knowledge that would be difficult to replace. Sir, with respect, any alternative approach will be slower and less certain, she replied. Al-Rashid trusts Dr. Halil in ways that he will never trust any other Western contact. If we try to penetrate his organization with a new operative, it will take months to establish credibility, and we don't have months." Admiral Thompson nodded in agreement. "General, Captain Mitchell is right about the timing, but perhaps we can modify her plan to reduce the risks. What if we provide her with more sophisticated backup and extraction options?" Sarah shook her head. "Any obvious backup will compromise the operation. Al-Rashid has survived this long because he's paranoid and careful. If he detects any hint that I'm not who I appear to be, the entire network will disappear within hours." The debate continued for another 30 minutes, with various officers proposing alternative approaches and Sarah explaining why each one would be less effective than her original plan. Finally, General Morrison made the decision that would determine whether her months of dangerous work would culminate in successful operations. "Captain Mitchell, you have authorization to proceed with Phase 2 of your plan, but I want detailed contingency plans for every aspect of the operation, and I want real-time communication capabilities that won't compromise your cover." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was now committed to returning to one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. But she also knew that the intelligence she had gathered would be worthless unless it was acted upon quickly and decisively. 2 weeks after the Pentagon briefing, Dr. Sarah Halil sat in a crowded cafe in Istanbul, nervously checking her watch while waiting for a contact who might never arrive. To anyone observing her, she appeared to be exactly what her false identity claimed: a Palestinian American doctor working with humanitarian organizations in the region. Her appearance had been carefully crafted over months of preparation, from the modest hijab she wore to the small gold cross that hung around her neck, indicating her Christian background. The transformation back into Dr. Halil had required more than just changing clothes and adopting an accent. Sarah had spent days immersing herself in the mindset and mannerisms that had kept her alive during her previous infiltration. She practiced speaking Arabic with the specific Palestinian dialect she had perfected, reviewed the detailed backstory that had been carefully constructed to withstand scrutiny, and mentally prepared herself to once again become someone who genuinely cared about providing medical assistance to people that Captain Mitchell was, working to capture or kill the psychological compartmentalization required for this kind of work was something that intelligence agencies studied, but never fully understood. Sarah had learned to genuinely inhabit her false identities, so completely that even she sometimes forgot which personality was real. It was a dangerous psychological state, but it was also what made her so effective in the field. Her phone buzzed with a text message. In Arabic, "The doctor you are waiting for has been delayed. Please meet at the spice market near the Blue Mosque in 1 hour." The message was from Ahmad Hassan al-Rashid himself, using a coded communication method they had established during her previous infiltration. The fact that he was personally involved in her recruitment indicated how valuable he considered her services. Sarah finished her tea and left money on the table, taking care to behave exactly as Dr. Halil would in this situation. She was nervous but eager, concerned about meeting with dangerous people but motivated by her genuine desire to help those who needed medical care. These conflicting emotions weren't difficult to portray because they reflected her actual feelings about the situation. The spice market was crowded with tourists and locals, providing excellent cover for a clandestine meeting. Sarah made her way through the narrow aisles, sampling spices and examining handcrafted items while keeping watch for Al-Rashid or his representatives. The sensory overload of the market, the smells, sounds, and constant movement helped her settle into Dr. Halil's mindset. She was examining a display of Turkish delight when a voice behind her spoke in accented English. "Dr. Halil, you look well. Your work with our people has been appreciated." Sarah turned to see Mahmoud al-Hassan, one of al-Rashid's most trusted lieutenants. He was a thin, bearded man in his 40s who managed much of the organization's logistics and personnel matters. During her previous infiltration, she had treated his teenage son for a serious infection, and he had developed genuine respect for her medical skills. "Mahmoud," she replied, allowing relief and pleasure to show in her voice. "I was beginning to worry that something had happened to you. The news from Syria has been very concerning." Al-Hassan nodded gravely. "There have been difficulties, which is why Ahmad needs to speak with you. Your medical expertise has become even more valuable to our cause, and there are new opportunities for you to serve those who fight for justice." They walked together through the market, discussing seemingly innocent topics while Al-Hassan evaluated whether Dr. Halil had changed in any way that might indicate her loyalty had shifted. Sarah knew she was being tested, and she carefully maintained the personality and perspectives that had made al-Rashid trust her in the first place. "I have been working with refugee populations in Jordan," she told him, which was partially true. She had indeed spent time in Jordanian refugee camps as part of establishing her cover for this return mission. "The medical needs are overwhelming, and the international organizations are not providing adequate support. When I received your message, I was hoping that Ahmad might have opportunities for me to do more meaningful work." This was exactly the response Al-Hassan had been hoping to hear. Dr. Halil's frustration with traditional humanitarian organizations was one of the reasons al-Rashid had been able to recruit her in the first place, and her continued commitment to serving Muslim communities made her a valuable asset. "Ahmad has been expanding our medical capabilities," Al-Hassan explained as they left the market and walked toward a small hotel where the meeting would take place. "We need someone with your skills to help train local doctors and nurses who can provide care in areas where traditional medical services are not available." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, understanding that this was exactly the opening she needed to gain access to al-Rashid's expanded network. If she could identify and locate the medical personnel being trained by the organization, she would have intelligence about their operational capacity and geographical reach. The hotel was modest but clean, the kind of establishment that catered to middle-class travelers and would not attract unwanted attention. Al-Hassan led her to a small conference room on the second floor, where al-Rashid was waiting with two other men she didn't recognize. Ahmad Hassan al-Rashid was in his early 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had the bearing of a man who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions, and his presence filled the room despite his unremarkable appearance. When Sarah had first met him months earlier, she had been struck by how ordinary he looked. He could have been a college professor or a successful businessman rather than one of the world's most wanted terrorists. "Dr. Halil," he said, standing to greet her warmly, "you look tired. The work with refugees is difficult, yes?" Sarah allowed exhaustion to show in her posture and voice. It wasn't difficult to portray, since the stress of preparing for this mission had indeed taken its toll. "It is heartbreaking work, Ahmad. So many people who need help and so few resources to provide it. When Mahmoud contacted me, I hoped you might have found ways to do more effective work." Al-Rashid gestured for her to sit, and tea was brought by one of his associates. The meeting began with seemingly casual conversation about the regional situation and the challenges facing Muslim communities throughout the Middle East, but Sarah knew that al-Rashid was carefully evaluating her responses, looking for any sign that her motivations or loyalties had changed. "I have been thinking about our previous conversations regarding the inadequacy of Western humanitarian organizations," al-Rashid said eventually. "You expressed frustration that these groups provide only temporary relief, rather than addressing the underlying causes of suffering." Sarah nodded, remembering the conversations he was referencing. Dr. Halil had indeed expressed such frustrations, because those feelings were necessary for her cover, but also because they contained elements of truth that made them convincing. "The Western approach to humanitarian aid is paternalistic and ultimately ineffective," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "They provide temporary medical care but never address the political and economic factors that create the need for such care in the first place." This was exactly the kind of response that had originally attracted al-Rashid's attention. Dr. Halil's criticism of Western policies, combined with her genuine medical skills, had made her seem like an ideal recruit for his organization. Al-Rashid leaned forward, his eyes studying Sarah's face intently. Dr. Halil, I have a proposal that could allow you to have much greater impact than your current work with refugee organizations. But it would require you to make a deeper commitment to our cause. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, knowing that this moment would determine whether her carefully planned operation would succeed or fail. She had to appear eager but not overly so, committed but not suspiciously enthusiastic. Dr. Halil would be intrigued by the opportunity to do more meaningful work. But she would also be cautious about the implications of deeper involvement with al-Rashid's organization. What kind of commitment are you talking about, Ahmad? She asked, allowing a note of concern to enter her voice. I want to help, but I also need to be careful about my work with the international medical community. Al-Rashid nodded approvingly. Her caution was exactly what he would expect from someone who had maintained successful cover for this long. I understand your concerns, and I would not ask you to compromise your other work unnecessarily. But we are establishing a network of medical training centers in several countries. These facilities would provide advanced medical education to local doctors and nurses who serve communities that have been abandoned by Western medical organizations. He gestured to one of the men Sarah didn't recognize, who spread a map across the table showing locations in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. Each of these centers would serve as both a training facility and a treatment center for serious medical cases. We need someone with your skills and your understanding of both Western and Islamic medical practices to help design the curriculum and train the instructors. Sarah studied the map carefully, noting that the proposed locations were in areas that would provide excellent cover for terrorist operations, while appearing to serve legitimate medical purposes. This was exactly the kind of information she needed to gather the geographical scope of al-Rashid's expanding network and the methods he was using to establish operational bases. This is very ambitious, she said, genuine admiration creeping into her voice. The training centers could serve thousands of people who currently have no access to quality medical care. But Ahmad, the resources required for something like this must be enormous. How are you able to fund such an extensive operation? Al-Rashid smiled, clearly pleased by her question. Dr. Halil's interest in the practical aspects of the operation confirmed that she was thinking like someone who genuinely wanted to participate, rather than someone who was merely gathering intelligence. Our funding comes from various sources, he replied carefully. Some from traditional donors who support our medical mission. But we have also developed business enterprises that generate sustainable revenue for humanitarian projects. The second man at the table, who had been introduced as Faisal al-Sharif, opened a briefcase and pulled out several documents. Dr. Halil, perhaps you would be interested in seeing some of the financial projections for the medical centers. Your background gives you a unique perspective on both the medical requirements and the operational costs. Sarah accepted the documents, scanning them quickly while maintaining Dr. Halil's focused but naive interest in the humanitarian aspects of the operation. What she was seeing confirmed her suspicions about the counterfeiting operation she had uncovered. The financial flows described in these documents were far too large and too regular to be coming from traditional charitable donations. These numbers are very impressive, she said, looking up from the papers. But Faisal, I have to ask, some of these revenue streams seem unusually stable for charitable organizations. In my experience with international medical groups, funding is always uncertain and irregular. Faisal exchanged a glance with al-Rashid before answering. You are correct that traditional charitable funding is unreliable? That is why we have diversified into business activities that generate consistent income. Import-export operations, primarily focused on consumer goods that are in high demand in European markets. Sarah nodded as if this explanation satisfied her curiosity, but she was mentally cataloging every detail of what she was hearing. The fact that they were willing to discuss their business operations with Dr. Halil suggested either that they trusted her completely or that they were preparing to involve her in aspects of their organization that would make it impossible for her to withdraw safely. I would very much like to be involved in establishing these medical centers, she said, making her commitment clear while leaving room for negotiation about the specific terms. But I need to understand what my role would be and what kind of time commitment you're expecting. Al-Rashid stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below while considering his response. Dr. Halil, what I'm about to propose will change your life significantly. We need you to relocate to Cyprus, where we are establishing the central coordination facility for all of our medical operations. From there, you would travel to each of the training centers to oversee their development and train their staff. The implications of this proposal were enormous. If Sarah agreed to relocate to Cyprus, she would gain access to the central nervous system of Al-Rashid's expanding network. But she would also be placing herself in a position where escape would become much more difficult if her cover was compromised. Cyprus is an interesting choice for a coordination center, she said thoughtfully. The location would make travel to the other sites relatively easy, and the medical infrastructure there is quite good. What she didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that Cyprus was also strategically located for coordinating operations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and its banking system provided excellent opportunities for moving money without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies. There is one more aspect of the proposal that we need to discuss, Al-Rashid said, returning to the table. Our medical operations have attracted attention from several intelligence agencies who believe that humanitarian organizations are being used as cover for other activities. We need someone who can help us identify and counter intelligence threats to our medical mission. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Al-Rashid was asking Dr. Halil to help identify other intelligence operatives who might be infiltrating humanitarian organizations. If she agreed to this role, she would be actively working to compromise other American and allied intelligence operations. That's a very concerning development, she replied, managing to inject appropriate worry into her voice. Are you saying that intelligence agencies are targeting legitimate medical organizations? Unfortunately, yes, Faisal interjected. They assume that any medical organization working with Muslim communities must have terrorist connections. It's a form of institutional racism that makes our humanitarian work much more dangerous. The conversation continued for another hour, with Al-Rashid and his associates outlining their expectations for Dr. Halil's role in their expanding organization. Sarah carefully balanced enthusiasm with appropriate concerns, agreeing to consider the proposal while negotiating for time to arrange her affairs before making such a significant commitment. As the meeting concluded, Al-Rashid handed her a secure phone and detailed instructions for maintaining communication while she considered his offer. Dr. Halil, I hope you understand that this opportunity represents a chance to have greater impact than any traditional humanitarian organization could provide. We are not just treating symptoms, we are building the infrastructure that will serve our communities for generations. Sarah accepted the phone and the instructions, knowing that she was now committed to a course of action that would either provide intelligence crucial to preventing terrorist attacks or result in her death if her true identity was discovered. The next phase of her operation would require her to appear to accept Al-Rashid's offer while secretly coordinating with her handlers to ensure that the intelligence she gathered would be used to dismantle the network she was pretending to join. 3 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell walked into the same Pentagon conference room where she had first revealed her intelligence about Al-Rashid's network. This time, however, the atmosphere was completely different. The room was filled with senior officials from multiple agencies, including representatives from the FBI, CIA, and Homeland Security. Admiral Thompson sat at the head of the table, and his expression showed both relief and pride as Sarah took her seat. The operation that had begun with Dr. Halil's apparent acceptance of al-Rashid's offer had culminated in the largest coordinated counterterrorism operation in recent history. Over the past 72 hours, law enforcement agencies in 6 countries had simultaneously raided terrorist safe houses, disrupted financial networks, and arrested more than 50 individuals connected to the planned attacks on American infrastructure. General Morrison opened the briefing with a summary of the operation's success. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report that Operation Silent Shield has exceeded all expectations. The terrorist attacks planned for the Miami Port, Chicago Transportation Hub, and Detroit industrial facilities have been prevented, and we have gathered intelligence that will protect American interests for years to come. Sarah listened to the summary while mentally reviewing the dangerous weeks she had spent as Dr. Halil, gradually gaining access to al-Rashid's inner circle while secretly feeding information to her handlers. The most challenging aspect of the operation had been maintaining her psychological balance, while appearing to enthusiastically support activities that she knew would result in civilian deaths if allowed to proceed. "Captain Mitchell," Admiral Thompson said, addressing her directly, "perhaps you could brief us on the final phases of your infiltration and how you were able to gather the actionable intelligence that made this operation possible." Sarah stood, no longer concerned about how her colleagues would perceive her capabilities. The success of the operation had definitively established her reputation within the intelligence community, but more importantly, it had prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. The key breakthrough came when al-Rashid asked Dr. Halil to help establish the Cyprus Coordination Center, she began. By accepting that assignment, I gained access to detailed information about the entire network structure, financing, and operational planning. She activated the room's display system and showed a complex organizational chart that revealed the true scope of al-Rashid's terrorist network. The diagram showed connections spanning multiple continents and involving legitimate businesses, humanitarian organizations, and financial institutions that had been either corrupted or established specifically to support terrorist operations. What we discovered was far more sophisticated than we had anticipated, Sarah continued. Al-Rashid wasn't just planning individual terrorist attacks. He was building a sustainable infrastructure for conducting ongoing operations against Western targets. The counterfeiting operation I had identified earlier was just one component of a diversified financial network that included legitimate import-export businesses, currency trading operations, and even investments in European real estate. Jake Harrison, who had watched Sarah's transformation from underestimated colleague to recognized expert, raised his hand. "Sarah, how were you able to maintain your cover while gathering such detailed intelligence?" Al-Rashid is known for his paranoia and security consciousness. Sarah smiled, remembering the psychological challenges of the operation. Dr. Halil's medical expertise made her indispensable to their operations, which gave me access that would have been impossible for a traditional intelligence operative. But the real key was that I genuinely became Dr. Halil when I was treating wounded terrorists or training local doctors. I wasn't pretending to care about their welfare. I actually cared, because that's who Dr. Halil was. The psychological complexity of maintaining deep cover was something that few people could truly understand. Sarah had been forced to develop genuine emotional connections with people she was simultaneously working to capture or kill, and the moral ambiguity of that situation had tested every aspect of her training and character. "There were moments when I had to make choices that still haunt me," she admitted. "Dr. Halil saved lives, including the lives of people who were planning to commit acts of terrorism. But if I hadn't saved them, if I had allowed Dr. Halil's medical ethics to be compromised, al-Rashid would have become suspicious and the entire operation would have failed." Admiral Thompson nodded with understanding. "Captain, your psychological evaluation reports indicate that you've managed to successfully compartmentalize these experiences without suffering permanent trauma. How do you assess your own psychological state following such an extended period of deep cover work?" It was a question that Sarah had been expecting. because the military was always concerned about the long-term effects of extreme, undercover operations on personnel mental health. The ability to become someone else so completely that even close associates were convinced was a rare and valuable skill, but it came with psychological costs that were not fully understood. Sir, I believe I've successfully integrated the Dr. Halil experience into my overall identity without losing my core sense of self as Captain Mitchell, she replied. But I also recognize that I've been fundamentally changed by spending months as someone else. Dr. Halil's perspective on humanitarian work and cross-cultural medical practice has given me insights that I wouldn't have gained through traditional military experience. The room was silent for a moment as everyone absorbed the implications of what she was describing. Sarah had not just gathered intelligence and prevented terrorist attacks. She had undergone a transformative experience that had expanded her understanding of the complex motivations and grievances that drove people to terrorism. The most important thing I learned, she continued, is that effective counterterrorism requires understanding not just the tactical and strategic aspects of terrorist operations, but also the human elements that make those operations possible. Al-Rashid's network succeeded because it provided genuine medical services to communities that had been abandoned by legitimate institutions. Dr. Halil's work was meaningful and valuable, even though it was ultimately used to support activities that I fundamentally oppose. General Morrison leaned forward, clearly interested in the broader implications of her observations. Captain, are you suggesting that our counterterrorism strategy should include more attention to addressing the underlying conditions that make terrorist recruitment possible? Sarah considered her response carefully, knowing that her analysis would influence policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Sir, what I'm suggesting is that purely military and law enforcement approaches to counterterrorism are necessary but insufficient. Al-Rashid was able to recruit Dr. Halil not through ideological persuasion but by offering her opportunities to do meaningful medical work that she couldn't do through traditional channels. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of officers who had spent their careers thinking about security threats in primarily military terms. If we want to prevent the emergence of future networks like Al-Rashid's, we need to ensure that people with valuable skills have legitimate opportunities to contribute to causes they believe in. Dr. Halil became vulnerable to terrorist recruitment because she was frustrated with the limitations of traditional humanitarian organizations. Admiral Thompson stood, signaling that the formal briefing was concluding. Captain Mitchell, your service during this operation has been extraordinary, and your insights will influence our approach to similar threats in the future. But I believe there's one more matter we need to address. Sarah looked puzzled, wondering what additional aspect of the operation needed to be discussed. Admiral Thompson walked to the front of the room and faced the assembled officers. Ladies and gentlemen, when Captain Mitchell first briefed us on her intelligence 3 months ago, many of us made assumptions about her role and capabilities based on incomplete information. Today, I think it's appropriate to formally recognize not just her success in this particular operation, but her outstanding service throughout her career. The Admiral's aide entered the room carrying a small wooden box, and Sarah realized what was about to happen. Admiral Thompson opened the box and removed a medal that represented one of the military's highest honors for intelligence operations. Captain Sarah Mitchell, for extraordinary heroism and exceptional service in conducting intelligence operations that prevented multiple terrorist attacks and saved countless American lives. It is my honor to present you with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Exceptional Service Medal. As Admiral Thompson pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform, the entire room stood and applauded. The recognition was meaningful not just for what it represented about her individual achievements, but for what it symbolized about changing attitudes toward who could be an effective intelligence operative and what kinds of sacrifices people were willing to make to protect their country.